Looking for the perfect gift for yourself or the beer lover in your life? Check out beeredge.com/merch for all of your Defend Pilsner and Camp Rauchbier needs. And also, don't forget to get with us on social media for the This Week in Rauchbier Facebook group or at TW Rauchbier on Instagram and Twitter to show us your smoked beers. From the blending of beer styles to create something new, grading barrels, fighting back against bullshit in beer, and sticking to a brewing ethos, Matt Manthe of Odd Breed Wild Ales is here to talk about microbes and more. First up, we're able to bring you this show each week thanks to these advertisers. Stomp Stickers. Stomp is a proud member of the Brewers Association that produces a wide variety of printed brewery products such as beer labels, keg collars, coasters, beer boxes, and much more. Stomp's website features an easy-to-use design tool, low quantity orders, fast turnaround times, and free domestic shipping. Visit stompstickers.com and use code DRINKBEER15 for 15% off your first order. And we're also brought to you by NZ Hops, a cooperative of master growers, whose legend and cultivars have been crafted for over 150 years with creativity and passion to produce some of the world's finest hops. With a dedicated hop breeding program and farming knowledge handed down through the generations, the current day master growers proudly provide 18 unique New Zealand hop varieties to the world. Visit nzhops.co.nz or find them on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn at NZHops Ltd to learn more. Inspired by Belgium and its beers, Matt Manthe has a strong respect for wild microbes, spontaneous ales, and the results that come from letting cultures express themselves. His professional brewing career and studies have taken him from South Carolina to Berlin and now to Florida, where he did the work of shift and head brewing, making clean beers for thirsty customers. Behind the scenes and at home, he was experimenting with his own house strain and thinking about long and wood-aged ales. You'd expect nothing less from a brewer who has a degree in microbiology. Odd Breed Wild Ales opened up in 2017, and it's the expression of Manthe and the beers he wants to make, the ones that come from an idea that often has to wait for months or years for a formal debut. From whole cone hops to locally sourced fruit to wild lagers, he's thinking about it all. Conversations like this are always fun and can go in unexpected ways. This is essentially a chat about three beers, but as you'll hear, it's actually about so much more. Matt spoke to me from the brewery in Pompano Beach, Florida. Here's our conversation. So as you look around the brewery and all of the barrels and everything that you have that's getting ready to go out into the world, is there anything currently resting that you're really excited for people to try, for, I guess, even for you to try as well?
Sure. Yeah. So the beer that I'm bottling this week is going to be Oddities and Outliers Blend 3. And so we recently got a little bit of notoriety for this series that we just recently started. We just won a gold medal at JBF for Blend 2. The concept for this series is to blend dissimilar beers. And so it's beers that are brewed differently, fermented differently, aged differently, and honestly don't really seem like they belong together. But that's kind of the fun and the challenge is putting these beers together to create something cohesive and something that's greater than the sum of its parts.
So let's talk about Blend 1 first then.
Sure. Yeah. So Blend 1 was a blend of the backbone really of that blend was a wild lager that was essentially brewed like a Munich Helles, single decoction, fermented cold with a German lager yeast, aged 36 months in neutral French oak puncheons. And that was blended with a couple of our lambic-inspired wild ales. Those lambic-inspired wild ales each were brewed a little bit differently, fermented a little bit differently. Those ones actually were not spontaneous, whereas the lambic-inspired blend that I used for Blend 2 was spontaneous.
Okay. For some reason, I have this old school idea of like a black and tan. Even though those were still fairly complementary flavors, you know, the idea of mixing two styles or hybrid styles, it's just not all that common. And it's one of those things that I'm really sort of tickled by. Before we talk about the next two blends, though, like when you were putting together the idea for Blend 1, Where did that idea process start? Like, what was the spark of inspiration for you?
So this probably sounds
So
a
I was
little
drinking
atypical.
really hard one night. Yeah.
Sounds kind of atypical
Yeah.
for most
I had
breweries,
some
but
Cantillon and I had some Bud Heavy. And
no,
I
it
said,
wasn't.
what would happen if I threw it in a Yeti tumbler? Yeah.
Wasn't quite like that. It was more so. So I kind of give my barrels a letter grade based on how I think of them from a sensory standpoint. I guess more of a qualitative standpoint actually, and that's A, B, C, and D. D are dumpers. Those are beers that are going down the drain. They just didn't turn out properly. A are beers that are great that I think should be served on their own. For the most part, those are beers that are designed to be served on their own that aren't part of a blend. And then B's are blenders and C's are complementary beers. The C's complementary basically meaning that there's nothing wrong with the beer, but there's also not quite necessarily anything exceptional or otherwise unique about it. And the B barrels, those are the blenders. Those are the ones that I think are really kind of unique, maybe a little bit too far in one direction to stand on their own. But those are the barrels that I find to be kind of fun to work with. And so the whole concept, I guess, for the Oddities and Outliers series was basically to take these barrels that were kind of the outliers in the brewery and try to put them to good use. And so trying to make something good with them, that's complex, that's balanced. That's really always my goal when it comes to blending beers.
So when you were putting the first one together, you had these two particular beers that were ready at the same time or ready-ish at the same time? Or did you have one and then come up with this idea and then wait for something else to come along?
So I have several of these 31-gallon, I call them cellar kegs. It's basically 2 half-barrel shells that are welded together. Sounds kind of crude, but but they look pretty.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've got
and if it works, don't knock it if it works.
Yeah. So I've got like a dozen of these, and I work primarily with large French oak puncheons, 500 liters. And so sometimes when I'm putting together a blend of something, I end up with some excess volume or just something that I don't feel like quite has a home yet. And so I'll put it in those cellar kegs. And so in the case of the wild lager that spent 36 months in barrels, that was actually one of the first barrels that I filled here at the brewery. Our brewery's about to be 4 years old. So I had that beer in one of these cellar kegs, 31 gallons of it anyway, for quite some time. And I was just kind of waiting for an opportunity to use it. And so when I started thinking about what I could use it with, I taste the beers in my barrels. I wouldn't say really on a regular basis, probably less frequently than most brewers do. But I try to keep a decent idea of what's going on in the different barrels, what I think is time sensitive versus what's going to get better with some more age, what is basically kind of plateaued. And I start thinking about, different ways that I could use those barrels, how they'll blend well, what maybe they're missing, and if they are missing something, how I can achieve the overall balance and complexity that I want in a blend.
Plateau is such an interesting word to use as well, though, because it whenever I talk to brewers in your space, I'm always really curious about when something is ready, or when you think it might almost be ready, or if you've missed a window and when it's passed you by, because it's so much of it is personal. I mean, a lot of it can be normal sensory stuff, but if you want these beers to be an expression of not only the wood and the microbes, but also you and your place, that's that third factor that sort of comes in. And plateau is not really a word that I think I've experienced or heard all that much from brewers in your arena. Is that a good thing? Like, if something gets to be plateaued, like, is it then just immediately ready to go out, or have you missed a shot at that point?
No, I would. So when I say plateaued, I mean, there's I guess there's different ways to approach that word, right? You could look at it as peaked, and then it's past, gonna go downhill after that. When I say plateau, I guess more so what I mean is just that this beer is as good as it's going to get, more or less.
Mhm.
and that I should figure out something to do with it within the next 3 to 4 months.
Okay. So you
when
still
I-
have some runway then.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Peak is a word that I guess an adjective that I would use more so describing beer that's in a very characterful spirit barrel, and or that's on fresh fruit. Especially with fresh fruit, I feel like I have a limited amount of time to work with. I've done some beers that spent a pretty long time, like 6 to 8 months on fresh fruit. But most of the stuff that I'm doing now, I've found that I'm getting better flavor, for the most part anyway, in about 4 to 6 weeks.
Really?
And then I actually prefer to do a longer bottle conditioning time instead. So, even our kegs, we naturally condition. And so I have another warehouse that's a few miles from our production facility that's just for bottle conditioning and keg conditioning. And as our brewery's gotten older, I've found that for the most part, the longer I leave a beer in a barrel, the longer conditioning time it needs in the package before I feel that it's ready to release.
So cutting out that middleman and going to the packaging sooner
from the fruit anyway. So I'm
Okay.
still re-fermenting all the fruit, just to be clear. I'm not putting out bottle bombs, at least so far. I don't believe I have. That's definitely not my intention. I don't write drink fresh, keep cold, or anything like that on the bottles. I try to explain to our consumers that the fruit beers are going to be their most vibrant when they're released, but that doesn't mean that they don't age well. And it, to a certain extent, depends on what the consumer wants. A lot of my beers with fruit, I actually prefer them after they've been in the bottle for a year or two.
Okay. And these are conversations that you've had with your customers over time.
Sure. Yeah. I try to explain it to them anyway. It's, in some ways, first of all, in South Florida, our beer market is still underdeveloped. We've had a lot of breweries that have opened up since my brewery. My brewery is almost 4 years old now. We're a week away from our 4-year anniversary, and we're actually one of the older breweries in the area. And my brewery is a little bit odd also in that I had a good bit, I think anyway, of production experience. I was brewing professionally for about 10 years before opening up Odd Breed, whereas the majority of the brewery owners down here, for the most part, just have homebrew experience, and certainly there's nothing wrong with that. But they have a little bit of a different approach to beer than I do, to put it mildly. And so it's actually gotten tougher for me over the years to explain the types of beers that I make and how they differ from other sour beers on the market. When we first opened, a lot of the people coming in that enjoyed sour beers were familiar with lambic and other wild ales, and they had barrel-aged sour beer before. Nowadays, most of the people that are coming in that haven't had our beer before, they're telling me that they enjoy sour beers. They're telling me about the beers that they like from various breweries, and they're all kettle sours. And certainly there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a very different product from what I make. And I found that some of the consumers actually prefer kettle sours. Others, fortunately, do prefer the product that I make. But from a production standpoint, a mindset, they're very different. And so the educational aspect of making these kind of beers, trying to inform our local consumer, is definitely tough. We do a decent bit of distribution, and I've noticed that the markets that we sell in that are more established, that have a long-standing craft beer scene, and preferably markets that have other breweries within our niche, it's an easier sell for us there. The consumers are more familiar with our product. They understand the intention, the purpose behind what we're doing.
That's really, when you were talking about fruit and how we sort of first got onto that, though, in South Florida, so many of the breweries that I think sort of led the charge down in South Florida, and I'm thinking like Wakefield and some of those, like, went all in on big sticky stouts, which I was always really sort of surprised about given the climate.
Sure.
But especially the fruit accented ones really seem to resonate as well. Do you find that if you do have a fruited version of your beers or beers with fruit, that those get a little bit more recognition or interest from local drinkers?
So yes and no. I would say
Okay.
initially, yes, absolutely. I've noticed, and perhaps it's just because my focus has shifted a little bit. But I'm finding now that most of our consumers that are really passionate about what we're doing, that are visiting the brewery, about every week or so, they're actually preferring a lot more of the blends that I'm putting together and the beers that are aged in unique spirit barrels after aging in our French oak puncheons. And so that's not to say that we aren't still selling the fruit beers, and we do sell more fruit beers than we do of our non-fruited beers, but it's definitely a different clientele also. So most of the people that are newer to what we do, I've found, are the ones that seem to gravitate towards the fruit beers, whereas those that have been our longtime customers that are familiar with the other producers within our niche, they're the ones that really seem to appreciate our unfruited beers. I also prefer unfruited beers. I do make a decent bit of fruit beers, and lately this year, one of my renewed focuses has been on using fresh local fruit. And so in South Florida, we have access to a lot of citrus and tropical fruit that other parts of the country just don't have access to.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that sets us apart also from the other breweries, really probably in the whole state of Florida, is that we only use fresh fruit. I don't use any aseptic purees. I don't use any concentrates. And you can get some good flavor with purees and concentrates. And there are certainly tons of breweries that use those. But one of the beers that I'm releasing next week is made with fresh passion fruit. And I could be wrong, but I don't know of a single commercial beer that's made with fresh passion fruit. And this is the first
You're
time
going to get the emails now.
I'm ready for them. I want to find out about the other breweries using them, because I love passion fruit. I think it works great in beer, and I'd love to try some products from other producers. But passion fruit's really expensive, and so I've been wanting to use it for a while. And I've used it on some small batch stuff that of course wasn't for sale. And but I reaching out to local farmers that want 10 to 15 bucks a pound for passion fruit. I can't really do that and then charge 75 bucks a bottle for the beer. Nobody's going to be too happy with me at that point. So it took me 4 years to finally find a good source for passion fruit, and it's still expensive, but it's commercially viable.
When you are, and I'm going to get back to oddities and outliers, but when you're using whole fruit, local fruit, I've been in breweries on days where they are peeling or they are slicing or they're getting things ready, and you talk to the newbies and they're pretty excited by it because they've never done it before. And then if you can find the assistant brewer, the head brewer who's done it, even 4 or 5 times, they look like death sort of warmed over, because it can be very labor intensive, and it is. You have to take in all sorts of sanitary considerations along the way. How do you prep for some of these days? I mean, let's use passion fruit as an example. Like what was the brew day like, or the days leading up to the brew day like?
So I use the fruit almost exclusively post barrel aging. I've done some fruited beers where I fruit them after primary fermentation, and then they go into a barrel. But for the most part, I'm working with beer that's essentially a finished beer, and so I already know which beer I'm going to blend onto the fruit. Usually I already have it in stainless steel waiting for me. And in the case of the passion fruit, it was something that kind of just suddenly showed up as a possibility for me to use. And so I believe I was processing it all. In fact, I remember now, it was a Thursday. I actually had a bartender that was out of town. So I was bartending and trying to process this passion fruit. And then I ended up taking me about 7 hours in total. I didn't have any help. It's 250 pounds. It wasn't fun, but this is an opportunity that I've been waiting 4 years for. And so I didn't want to let that pass by. And, you got to use the fruit when it's ripe. And so, yeah, I just had to stick it out and make it happen. But, we do a beer every year with fresh peaches. Mm-hmm. You can actually grow peaches in Florida, not where I live, but about 2 hours north of where I am. Yeah, I can get peaches, and they're a special cultivar that's designed for Florida. So it's they don't grow very big. They have a very short growing season. They get to be about the size of plums if you're lucky. And
Okay.
so that means that I've got about twice as many peaches to process per pound.
Yeah.
Um, but fortunately for that, I'm usually able to plan farther in advance. And so I have some friends that come in, and we try to make a party of it. I give them beer and both draft beer while they're working and some bottles to go. And fortunately, there are a lot of them that seem to really enjoy it. Some of them are homebrewers, others are just friends. But I'm a really small team. I have 2 part-time bartenders, and then one of my business partners helps me out with a lot of the distribution logistics. But I'm it as far as the production side goes.
So you have to be psyched about doing this then.
Oh yeah. I mean, my philosophy, I guess, with using fresh fruit, I have people all the time, other brewers as well as vendors that hit me up by email or call the brewery, telling me about their aseptic purees or whatnot.
Oh yeah.
And I don't mean to sound snobby, but it's I'm putting a lot of work and time and effort into these beers that I make. They're spending 1 to 3 years in barrels. Uh, I don't want to pull them out and then just add some ubiquitous pasteurized puree that's one dimensional. If I'm going to put all this work and effort into trying to make this really bright complex beer, I want to use the best fruit that I can, and it's my belief that I'm going to get the best fruit flavor from using fresh fruit. And so I would rather not use fruit if my option were to use concentrates or purees. So I don't make as many fruit beers as other breweries within our niche, and that's intentional.
Let's jump back then. So your first one comes out and you're happy with it, presumably. Uh, is that when you wanted to continue on with an Oddities and Outliers series?
Oh, I planned it to be a series all
you
along.
did? So right from the beginning. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, it was. So most of the beers that I make, because I'm aging in puncheons, which by the way I think is something that's not entirely unique within our niche, but definitely separates us from a lot of other breweries. And that most breweries, I think, within our niche are using standard sized wine barrels.
Mm-hmm.
Some are using foeders. You'll find that most traditional lambic brewers are using puncheons.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that, or at least I should say, the reason that I'm using them, I assume that they're using them for similar reasons, but the reason that I prefer them is that they have less surface area in the larger barrels. There's thicker staves, so I'm letting less oxygen into the barrels. I find that the beer ages a lot nicer, and it ends up being softer. It's more complex. I don't find as many barrels that are too heavy in one direction when they're coming out of puncheons. And so most of the beers that I make, probably 2/3 or so, maybe even more, are not blended beers. I'm brewing a recipe. Basically, I do a 20 hectoliter batch, so that's about an 18 barrel batch, and I'll transfer that into 4 of my 500 liter puncheons, and each of those barrels, for the most part, within that same batch, will taste pretty much the same. And to the point where there isn't even really much purpose in blending those 4 barrels together. I'm not really going to achieve much more than I would from just pulling out of one of them. So the concept really for Oddities and Outliers, in part, was just from a business standpoint of trying to figure out a home for these barrels. These are beers that otherwise aren't necessarily bad.
Yeah.
But some of the beers that I brew, I don't have a specific intention for. I try to keep at least a mental notes of what I have in barrels. If I have a lot of one particular beer that really expresses, whether it be our aged hops or maybe a certain type of funk, and I'm thinking, man, I need something that's got some more citrusy type notes, maybe something that's got more American hops in it, which is actually something I guess that kind of sets us apart from a lot of other breweries, is that I do use a lot of hops. So our lambic inspired beers have about 2 pounds to 2.5 pounds per barrel of aged hops in the kettle. I do some hoppy saisons that are around 40 to 50 IBUs. Most of those I'm actually not using on their own. They're actually for blending, and sometimes only a little bit is needed to kind of push the blend in the right direction. But the Oddities and Outliers series was something that once I kind of came up with the idea, I thought, oh man, this will be kind of a cool thing to play around with. It's it kind of give me the outlet to do a little bit more blending,
Yeah.
which, as I mentioned, isn't something I do a ton of.
Right.
I do some blends that are that'll be like 80 to even 90% one beer, and then it's just that little bit of something that kind of brings the overall flavor into the direction that I want. Also, as the brewery's gotten older, I've been in a situation where I've had a lot of beers that are 2 years plus in barrels,
Mm-hmm.
and I like to use a little bit of younger beer, if only for the purpose to bring in some fresh yeast, to bring in our mixed culture, to get some active Brett in the bottle.
Um, God, see, I love this conversation because you just there's like a dozen things that I want to follow up on, but the one, I guess the two that sort of stick with me are some of your blends being 80-90% of one beer and then just 20 or 10% of another. There's something really interesting about, I was almost picturing being in the kitchen and saying, hey, this dish is really good, but it just needs something. And you go to the pantry and you find something that just sort of works to help it just pop.
Sure.
The fridge,
Yeah.
or something like that. Is there a good example of one of your beers where it was 90% something, and
Yeah, so
where your brain went? Yeah.
I haven't released it yet, but yeah, a lot of what I do is somewhat improvisational like that, and that the market's always changing, and that's I think, just backing up a little bit, that's one thing that's been a constant challenge for my brewery, is that I can't respond to market conditions as quickly as say typical breweries can, and so.
So you totally missed brewed IPA, is what you're saying.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Unbeknownst to most consumers, I got some in barrels right now. I'll release it in a few years when
I got bad news for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So going back to one of those blends that I did recently. So I do what I call our flagship saison, Past and Future. I've released 4 batches of it in 4 years. So we've kind of shifted into the direction of not really having flagships or even regular beers. And a lot of that is just our local consumer base just really wants something new every time. And so even the beers that I've rebrewed, which I think we've released like 130 or so different beers, maybe a dozen of them or so I've made more than one batch of. And on all of those beers, the reason I made a second batch or third, or in the one case, Past and Future 4 batches, is because they were well received. But I've noticed that each time I brew another batch of the beer, the sales aren't the same as what it was for the first go around. And we get some people
they drop.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes significantly. And some of it is because, we get people that just, they say they over purchased the first time around, and they still have, 2 cases of this beer in their cellar. And
okay,
like, all right, well, thanks for buying those the first go around, but blend 2 is better. And, sometimes they listen to me, other times they don't. But anyway, all that is to say is that Past and Future, our saison is supposed to have a barrel aging time of 1 year. And I ended up using 3 of the 4 puncheons for blend 4. One of them, it just didn't really make sense for me to blend in. And not because there was anything wrong with the beer, it was just a volume thing. And, it was, well, I've only got so many kegs and so much room in house. And does it make sense for me to package up this volume of beer? No, I should find something else to do with this barrel. So that barrel actually ended up kind of getting away from me a little bit, and it ended up spending 2 years in that barrel.
Wow. Okay.
I honestly had, after about 18, 19 months in the barrel, had just kind of written it off as something that was going to be a loss, that I wasn't going to get to pull out of the barrel in time, that I had missed my harvest window on it, and that I should just move on and focus on something else. About every 4 to 6 months, I try some of my barrels that basically fall into that category and say, what is this beer any good? Is there anything that I can do with this? Does it have any potential? Or is it going down the drain? And So I tried this barrel and was very pleasantly surprised by it. It had aged very nicely. It was very soft. Didn't develop too much acetic acid. All of our beers are going to have some acetic acid because they're in barrels and they're fermented with Brettanomyces. But I'm pretty sensitive to acetic acid and ethyl acetate. I really don't like those flavors. And when I tried this beer, I was really surprised at how nice the funky Brett quality was on it, how good the tannins were, and I didn't really want to release it just on its own because I wanted something to differentiate it a little bit more from past and future. And so I took two other beers, a wild lager that spent 6 months in barrels, and then more of a hoppy, funky saison that also spent about 6 months in barrels. And so I blended those three beers together. The overall beer, I should know this offhand because I just bottled this up a few weeks ago, but I want to say it was somewhere around 85 to 90% of that 2-year-old past and future. And so I'll release that probably late spring of next year.
Okay. Why late spring? What do you want it to do in between now and then, or so what do you hope it does?
Yeah, so I've found that the beers that I make where I'm blending something kind of dissimilar like that, it just takes a while in the bottle for them to kind of come together and be more cohesive. Especially when I've got something that like this beer where the majority of the blend is 2 years old.
Yeah,
the beers that I make that re-ferment fruit are actually ready the fastest. And my theory on that is just that they've recently been fermenting, and so the everything that I do is 100% naturally conditioned, and so it takes a little while for some of the what I call intermediate off flavors to go away, and so it's the beer is usually carbonated within a month or so, but it doesn't usually taste very good at that point. It might have some components that taste nice, that taste almost ready, but the overall profile of the beer usually takes at least a few months after that before it's really ready. But the exception being the fruited beers, and again, I think that's just because there's a lot more active yeast in solution. It just completed a fermentation, and so when it goes into that bottle, it's carbonating much quicker. Usually within a week or two, and so it just doesn't need as much time.
It's almost like, chilies and soups always taste better the next day.
Sure. Yeah, no, exactly like that. Yeah.
It's sort of inelegant compared to, you got a Texas beef chili versus what you're doing, but still, I
love chili.
I get the idea there. More in a quick moment, but first, thanks to the companies that keep the mics hot over here. When it comes to printed brewery products, head to Stomp Stickers. The company is a reliable resource for printed items such as beer labels and boxes, keg collars, coasters, and more. Visit stompstickers.com and use code DRINKBEER15 for 15% off your first order. And we're also brought to you by NZ Hops, a cooperative of master growers, whose legend and cultivars have been crafted for over 150 years to produce some of the world's finest hops. NZ Hops are like no others, unique in their flavors and aromas. Visit nzhops.co.nz to explore more. And now, back to my conversation with Matt Manthe of Odd Breed Wild Ales. One of the other things, though, that, before we started talking about blending was you said that there were, some beers that you brew that you have no intention for, that you're just sort of brewing these beers and, maybe they'll turn into something, maybe, or they'll be used. I'd love to know more about that, but also then you come up with these recipes and you have an idea of what you want these to be. And I think I'm having a tough time sort of circling that square of you've created a recipe, you've now made a recipe, and then its future is unknown.
Yeah, to a certain extent, that's kind of fun, I feel like. But so
it's got to be stressful too, though.
Oh yeah, it is. I try not to obsess over the kind of stuff that I can't really change. I was telling one of my business partners the other day, because he mentioned something similar, and I was like, you just got to trust the process and the science. And there's only so many things that you can control, especially with wild beer. There are so many variables at play, and there, on the one hand, you can choose to look at each one of those variables and try to control them the best that you can, or you can say, you know what, these variables are beyond my control. These are the ones that I can control. These are the ones that I feel that I need to focus on, and so that's kind of what I try to do. And so the beer that I brewed most recently, on paper anyway, the recipe looks kind of like a hazy double IPA, and I brewed that beer really with the sole intention of using it as something to blend with some of my older barrels, something to add some nice citrus, tropical fruit flavor. The higher ABV and the elevated IBUs in the beer mean that it won't have much acidity. Our mixed culture does have a good bit of hop tolerance, and so it can produce acidity in something that's 50 IBUs. If it sits long enough, even something with 60 IBUs will develop some acidity and finish around a pH of like 3.8. And you can't do that with lab cultures, but because our mixed culture is so far removed, it has that kind of ability. But going back to what I was mentioning earlier, a lot of it is just kind of taking mental notes of what I have in barrels, what kind of flavor profiles I can get from those barrels, and then also what I feel like I'm missing or what I'm low on. So with my fruited beers, for example, I prefer using our lambic inspired base beer. It's a turbid mash. I do some of those spontaneously. Others are just with our mixed culture. It really kind of depends on the time of year here. Mm-hmm. But that's a beer that has a lot of aged hops in it. It has tons of tannins, and it doesn't have too much acidity, especially if it's less than about a year and a half old. And those are great beers for me to use with fruit because fruit is going to lend acidity. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget nowadays in beer, because there are so many breweries that are making, kettle sours or other beers with fruit where they're not even really fermenting the fruit. They're basically taking a finished beer and dosing in fruit puree or whatever into the bright tank and telling customers to drink it cold before, inevitably it starts re-fermenting and builds up pressure and potentially explodes.
Yes.
So I think a lot of people, I get it all the time. People come into the tasting room and they look at our menu and they see the section that says fruit beers and they say, oh yeah, I want one of your fruit beers. Those are going to be sweeter. And, I'm like, no, actually those are going to be the most sour beers that I have here. And they don't understand that. And it's simply because all the sugar in the fruit is fermented out, and you're left with the acidity that is in that fruit. And so, peaches, apricots, raspberries, passion fruit, those lend a good bit of acidity, especially the Florida peaches that we have. And so I've been kind of making micro adjustments to the recipes that I use, especially for Florida peaches every year. Mm-hmm. And this year I feel like I finally got the acidity dialed in where I want it. And it's simply, taking into account the fact that I'm going to be getting a lot of acidity from the fruit. So when I'm trying to figure out what I need to brew next, a lot of it is just kind of taking inventory of what I have in the barrels, what those barrels are going to be destined for, more or less anyway. I try to leave a certain number of barrels and certain number of types of barrels that I use specifically for improvisational stuff. Yeah. And stuff that just, seems to be the best use of that barrel at the time. But there are other barrels that I'll fill, and from day one I know this is a barrel that I'm going to use for this fruit.
So it's like stocking the pantry, like we were talking before, of like going in and in some cases, like having absolutely. Something on hand. Yeah,
definitely is. It's definitely a different mindset from a typical brewery, because I'm thinking several months and even years out. In August of this year, I finished packaging up all the beers that I'm planning to sell this year. And so the beers that I'm bottling up right now, I'm planning to sell in April and May of next year. So it's we definitely operate on a different time schedule.
All right. So we started off a very long time ago now talking about oddities and outliers, and we got through the first one, and then you opened up all these veins of conversation. What did you do for the second debut or for the second turnaround?
Yeah, so blend two, I was really happy with how that one came out. So three very different beers. Almost half of the blend, I believe it was about 48% of the blend, was a dry hopped wild ale that was brewed more or less like an IPA, but hopped with very late additions. I believe I threw in some hops, 10 minutes left in the boil, and then the majority was in the whirlpool. Fermented out entirely just with our mixed culture, spent 16 months in French oak barrels. And then I blended that with about 38% of one of our lambic inspired turbid mash beers that was spontaneously fermented. And then the smallest component in that blend was that same 36-month-old lager that I used in blend one. So that was, I want to say, about 10% of the blend, 10, 12%, 14% of the blend, actually, I think, if I remember that correctly. Anyway, after that, I lightly dry hopped the blend with whole cone American hops. I only dry hop with whole cone hops.
Okay.
And part of that is because of my equipment. And I don't have any conical tanks. I don't have a glycol chiller. And whole hops just work better with my equipment. But I also really like the flavor more. I feel like it has kind of an old school hop flavor. There's just something different about whole cone hops compared to pellets as far as the flavor profile. And
I don't know. I've talked to obviously the companies that sell pelletized hops that really want you to believe that there's not a difference, but
yeah, there definitely is. I know what you mean, and but there's a certain like grassiness. I mean, they call them T90 pellets for a reason, and that's because they're missing 10% of the material that's otherwise found in whole cone hops. Now, I don't know how much of a difference exactly that 10% of the material makes, but in my experience, there is definitely a difference.
Is there something that you can point to on your palate that you've been able to notice?
It's really just kind of a grassiness. I wish I could describe it better, but it's so. I guess going back a little bit to something I mentioned earlier about how we use a good bit of hops just in general, is there's a mouthfeel aspect. It's a textural thing, and I feel like that's a big thing that a lot of brewers making sour and wild beers are missing out on. Is I purposefully try to put a lot of body in my beers, and you talk with some other producers that make great beers, by the way, and they'll talk about how their beer finishes at 0 Plato. I don't want that. Usually my driest beer finishes at 1.7 Plato. And, that's actually a pretty high finishing gravity for a wild ale. And that's intentional. And I feel like when you do that combined with a decent amount of hops, the beer ends up being multi-layered, and it's not just kind of a quick one and done sort of approach that may make a fine and drinkable product, but I feel like it's missing something. And so I've personally noticed just with my own beers, and this could be a different experience than from what other people would get from their mixed cultures. But I just feel like using whole cone hops, I just get a different layer of flavor, and it tastes like a more complete beer. And also because that most breweries aren't using whole cone hops nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's something that also kind of separates us from those other breweries. Even if the customer tries it, they don't know the fact that we're using whole cone hops. Maybe they don't care. But I'll bet that they taste the difference. Whether they know that that's what the difference is or not, kind of doesn't matter.
It's interesting to hear you say, like, even if they don't know or don't care, but it's important to you at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to compromise on the beers that you're making. And, even if you did have conicals or glycol or, it sounds like you just, pellets aren't what you want for you as a brewer.
Sure. Yeah. That's not to say that you can't make great beer with it. And if
I didn't know, and you certainly didn't say that.
Yeah. No, but I guess what I mean is that, if I did have conical tanks and I did have a glycol chiller, well, then I probably would use pellets because they're more practical, they're more efficient, they're cheaper. They don't take up as much space. There's a huge list of reasons why most brewers use pellets. And if I had, a glycol chiller and conical tanks, I'd probably be using pellets, and I'd probably figure out some way to otherwise try to achieve what I'm trying to achieve with my beers now. I just have to go about it differently. Maybe there would be something else that I would change to try to achieve the texture and mouthfeel that I want in the beers. Could be something different in the brew house, could be something different with ingredients, with malts, I don't know. But to a certain extent, I've found what I think works for me. And I'm brewing for my palate too. And I think that's something that's very different for Odd Breed versus a lot of other breweries out there, is that I'm a little spoiled in that I make beers for myself. And, I think nowadays most brewers, they don't really get to do that. I talk with brewers all the time that kind of embarrassingly tell me about these stupid beers that they're making, and they refer to them as stupid, not just me. But that's craft beer in 2021. We're making beers a lot of times for a completely different beer drinker than what existed 10 years ago.
There is something about staying true to yourself and staying true to the mission, because I mean, I talk to those brewers all the time who are saying, yeah, we brewed this something stupid. And then they're saying, but we also made payroll this week.
Sure.
And it
is a business.
Yeah. Have you had temptation to, or felt the pressure, if somebody says, well, why don't you just put on like a regular hazy, just for the tap room, just for the people who are asking for it. Has that happened?
Sure. So I'm maybe a little bit embarrassed to say this, in part because I don't like hazy IPAs, but that beer that I was talking about that I most recently brewed, mm-hmm. I do have that on draft right now.
Okay.
As a non-barrel aged, non-wild beer.
Okay.
Now it was open fermented. Most of it is in barrels right now. And I put that on draft, and I don't really push it, but I like, when people come into the tap room, I want to offer something that they enjoy. And so something that's unusual for our brewery, I don't know how typical this is in other parts of the country, but I think I've got like 40 different beers on my guest beer menu. We also sell wine, we sell some natural ciders, and it's simply because I want people to come in here and find something that they enjoy. Yeah. What we do is very foreign to a lot of people, especially in South Florida. And, all these other beers that I'm carrying from other producers around the world, and most of them are actually from outside the US, they're awesome beers. I mean, they're beers that I picked because I think they span the whole gamut of different types of flavors, not necessarily all styles. But, if somebody comes in and they tell me that they normally drink such and such beer, chances are I'm not going to have that beer. And I'm going to offer them something that they've never heard of. Yeah. But usually they approach it with an open mind, and they really enjoy that product. But part of the reason that I put this beer on draft, non-barrel aged, not with any discernible wild character to it, is simply because we get a lot of people who come in that want to insist on drinking our beer. And sometimes I can't offer them something that makes them happy. And I see them, sitting over there with a grimace, drinking our beer, saying, oh yeah, it's great. And, meanwhile, I know I'm never going to see that person again. But, part of the reason that I haven't caved in and adopted a more flexible business model is as far as the styles of beer that I make, is simply because I don't really have that as a luxury. I opened this place from day one. And by the way, I spent a long time looking for the right spot, because I'm in South Florida. I keep my spot at 69 degrees year round, trying to find an industrial property that's zoned for manufacturing, that's, well insulated, that has AC in place. That it's really tough, especially because I'm not in a huge space, and so it took a while for me to find this spot. Everything that I set up as far as our production area, it's very intentional. And, I don't have the flexibility to just say that I'm going to make a different style of beer one day. Right. My tanks are typically used for wine. They don't hold pressure, not more than about 2 PSI anyway. Okay. They're not conical. I don't have a glycol chiller, as I mentioned. I'm not doing forced carbonated beers. Everything's naturally conditioned. So they're just, I don't really have those options. So it almost in some ways makes it easier to stay true to what I set out to do, for better or worse.
I mean, I just the pandemic has screwed up so much where I miss doing these things in person because I feel like we'd be having a lot of fun opening up bottles right now and just sort of talking nuance and
Oh yeah,
process
for sure.
and et
I'm
cetera, et
I'm
cetera.
bummed that I
So
missed the Funk Fest this year.
I know it was a lot of fun, and that's I know we were talking about hopefully doing something there, and then I mean I'm grateful for the opportunity, obviously, to be talking with you now, but so much is just been lost from the in person drinking experience, and conversations like this really drive it home for me. But in a perfect world, which it's not, I'd be getting on a plane next week to come down for the third release of Oddities and Outliers. Right? You said it's next week.
Oh no, no,
Um,
I'm bottling
oh,
it
you're
this week.
bottling it next week.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it won't be ready until like late spring or potentially even early summer.
Oh,
I'm going to release Blend 2 next week. So
that's okay. Sorry,
yeah, yeah,
I'm my
we had a lot
timeline
of.
is all screwed up. Yeah.
No, that's all right. Yeah, well, that's actually something that's been a little tricky for me because I do our social media stuff too, and I actually got out of the habit of telling people what I'm putting into bottles because I have people calling the brewery asking, can I pick up such and such beer today? I'm like, no, it's not even carbonated. It's well, when is it going to be released? I don't know, like 4 months, and but that's just the way that we operate. It's a different type of brewery in that sense. But we're really fortunate to win the gold medal at GABF this year for Oddities and Outliers Blend 2.
Yeah.
And some people were reading the description on it and they're like, that's not what it tastes like. And I was like, no, you had Blend 1. Blend 2 hasn't been released yet.
It's kind of fun winning a medal for a beer that hasn't been released yet.
Yeah, it is kind of cool. I was trying to figure out what beers I wanted to send off, and of course, everything else that I decided to send off was labeled and already had been sold. And but there was just something kind of unique about that beer. I felt like it hit all the right um, uh, areas, and I don't know. It's just something about the nuance and complexity of that beer. There's I feel like I'm not always that great at describing what that just like extra little unique character is, but that beer has it.
So as you're now getting ready for Blend 3, there's obviously two iterations that you've gone through that you've learned from, you've messed around with, you've obviously had great success with, at least on the judging scale. How did you, when you started planning out Blend 3, did you change up the approach? Was there anything that you would learn that you put into practice?
A little bit. So the Oddities and Outliers series, for the most part, has a little bit more of a focus on some of our oldest barrels, and those are oftentimes the ones that have some really nice, unique character, but they can also be kind of rough around the edges. And so, what I mean by that is that they're more likely to have a pretty discernible level of acetic acid and sometimes ethyl acetate. And those are flavors that can be kind of tough to blend out, I feel like. And so sometimes it's trying to pick flavors that seem complementary to that. But usually when I make these blends for this series and otherwise, I, for the most part, already know what I want to do. It's usually a question of what percentages, and I usually, for the most part, already have a general idea of what percentage will achieve what I want. But I feel like I'm still getting better. I'm always trying to learn more, and one of the things that I really like about making these kind of beers, our slogan is flavor from fermentation. We're a fermentation focused brewery, and so what I mean by that is that you can't buy our mixed culture from a yeast lab. We're not making paint by numbers beers, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And you can make great beers with that type of approach. There are certainly some breweries that are well known for their hazy IPAs, and they seem to release a new beer every week that's really the same beer with just like a minor change to the hops.
Yes.
Or the order that the hops are added in the kettle, or dry hop, or whatever it may be.
Oh yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but I really like the fermentation aspect, and I feel like so many breweries overlook your fermentation, your yeast, in our case, yeast and bacteria, as one of your ingredients, multiple ingredients in our case, and I feel like there's so much complexity and unique flavor that you can derive from your fermentation that it seems to be somewhat of an afterthought for a lot of breweries, and I think that's kind of a shame. But you know, making these types of beers is something that you can learn the basics of. I feel like reading books or listening to other podcasts. The Milk the Funk Wiki is
Oh
a
yeah.
great resource, and it's really cool that all that information is out there now. But I think really just anecdotal experience is really important, especially if you're using your own unique mixed culture of wild yeast and bacteria. It's going to behave differently in different breweries, and it's going to behave differently based on what your equipment is, what your approach is. And so that's not to say that I don't try to learn from other brewers, but I feel like your own experience of just making the beers, just jumping in head first and trying to figure out how to make something the best that it can be. That's really what's meaningful. So I am learning, still as I go. And I feel like I know way more about my mixed culture now than I did 4 years ago. And I put this blend together about 8 years ago. And, it's all been managed in-house by me since then. And it's evolving, it's mutating, for the most part in the direction that I want it to go.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about it. Yeah. Just like when you're tasting it, when yeah, I mean, in so many ways, it's like the house, the house DNA,
Sure.
these house cultures. Are there telltale flavors, telltale aromas that you feel are, particular to Odd Breed because of your house strain?
Oh yeah, there definitely are. And, I wish I could describe that better. I mean, I don't know where you start on trying to describe something like that,
Yeah.
and the way I view it is going to be different from how someone else views it. And, one thing that's really interested me, especially in the last couple of years or so, is working on different ways to manipulate our mixed culture to produce different types of flavors. And so, when I first started uh, dabbling with, really, I guess when I started focusing more, I should say, on some mixed culture fermentations, I was basically running a rudimentary yeast lab that I put together in an extra room, and I was managing multiple different blends. And I think I was working with something like 20 to 30 different microbes. I got my undergraduate degree in microbiology, so I have a little bit of an understanding of this stuff, but it's
A little bit, I'd hope. Yeah.
I was doing this on a really rudimentary level, and I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that I actually don't even own a microscope right now. I've been putting my funds into other things, but the truth is, and I have looked at our mixed culture under a microscope, and it doesn't tell me as much as my anecdotal experience does, as much as sensory does. And also, just kind of monitoring fermentations, figuring out how long it takes for this to happen versus that to happen. But I think that our mixed culture is relatively soft, especially compared to a lot of laboratory strains. I think that one thing that a lot of breweries get wrong when they try to make these sort of styles is they don't include enough biodiversity. Meaning that they want to use 2 Brett strains or 1 Brett strain. Brett doesn't have a huge genome compared to Saccharomyces. It produces some interesting flavors, but if you use 1 or 2 strains of Brett, you're going to get some really dominant over-the-top notes in a couple of areas. Right. And those might be some nice flavors, but they're not going to be in balance. It's not going to be subtle, and in my opinion, doesn't create a really drinkable product. I originally put 16 strains of Brettanomyces in our mixed culture. And when I first did it, it was actually just kind of an experiment. I just wanted to see what would happen. And and the beer turned out really well. And so I kept kind of reusing that mixed culture. And this was about, I guess, 6 years ago now or so, that I had a 20-gallon system in my garage. I was still working as a head brewer at another brewery while I was trying to open Odd Breed, while I was doing these homebrew batches, test batches, whatever you want to call them. But basically, I was brewing 20-gallon batches, and I would split them into 4 carboys and ferment them out differently and try to figure out, what I liked most about different yeast strains, about different blends. And once I started messing around with what is today our mixed culture, I think I brewed like 4 or 5 beers, or I should say fermented 4 or 5 beers with our mixed culture, and decided, you know what, I'm just going to focus on this. This keeps producing my favorite beers. They weren't quite as predictable then from a fermentation standpoint as they are now. But I felt like, ultimately I wanted to open a brewery, and I didn't want to open a microbiology lab. And sure. So I decided to kind of really focus just on that one mixed culture. And then especially in the last couple of years, learning more about how I can manipulate the flavors in that. And the main ways that I'm doing that, I guess really 3 things. One is using a different strain for primary fermentation. And I've tried multiple different things, whether it be Belgian ale yeast, English ale, some Saison type strains, and they all end up producing a little bit of a different flavor in the final product. 2 would be IBUs, not just hopping, but actual IBU numbers. Higher the IBU, the more funk I'm getting for the most part.
Okay.
And then 3rd, and this is something that I feel like is definitely an underutilized tool by most breweries, and that is pH at the onset of fermentation. And so I do some beers, especially hoppy beers, that I want to have more of a citrus and tropical flavor from. I'll blend in anywhere from about 10 to 15% of a mature sour beer, specifically for the purpose of lowering that pH below 4. I've found that with my mixed culture, when I'm doing my fermentation in an environment that has a starting pH below 4, I'm getting tons of these citrus and tropical esters, and it's subduing some of the funk. And especially in something that has more IBUs, that beer isn't going to be too sour because of the IBUs keeping the souring bacteria in check. But getting that pH below about 4 or so really drives more of the flavor notes that seem to work better in tandem with citrusy American hops. And then the fun comes in just blending those different components together.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I mean, the results speak for themselves, but still that's, so you're having fun.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I started this brewery, is I wanted to have fun. I wanted to make the kind of beers that inspire me, that get me excited to go work in the brewery. It's a lot of hard work. It's very hands-on, especially at the kind of beer that I'm making. It's I'm touching literally every bottle, that's filled, and a few times, by the way, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I wish it was a little bit more efficient in some ways, but there's really a lot of care and passion that's put into these beers, and a lot of intention too. And I feel like that's something that really is lost amongst a lot of brewers nowadays, is that I brew relatively large batches for the size of our operation. And so, I only brew usually once or twice a month. And those are recipes, even though some of them I only brew once, they're beers that I think about for a long period of time before the brew day. And I'm thinking about everything from, obviously the recipe formulation, but also how I'm going to brew it in the brew house, whether I'm going to do any turbid mashes, decoctions, what step mashes I want to do on it. Am I going to use the hop back? Do I want to use whole cone hops? Do I want to use aged hops and fresh hops? What sort of flavor profile am I looking for with that? I've done some things where I'm intentionally adding coriander to a beer in the whirlpool to increase the geraniol content, so that I get more citrus character in the finished beer. And then of course how I'm planning to ferment it, what I want my knockout temperature to be, because I don't have a glycol chiller. I got to think about, especially the time of year. If I'm bringing back wort to my place in the summer, that wort's going to warm up by a few degrees, because I don't own a brew house, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but I'm doing the old lambic technique of brewing at somebody else's brewery and then bringing wort back to my place. So there's
I wouldn't. I known that beforehand, but I wouldn't have expected it any other way. before we
Yeah.
talked for the type of beers that you're making. All right, so then to bring it home from where we started, can you tell us about the third version? Is it ready for you to discuss, or are you trying to keep
I
it
can
quiet?
discuss it.
Okay,
I'm pretty excited about it. It's it's a barrel. It's based around a barrel of 3.5-year-old lambic inspired turbid mash beer. It was brewed back. When was that? I want to say it was June of. No, actually, it was May of 2018.
simpler
And
times.
yeah, and so that's really kind of the backbone of the beer, and then it's being blended with our I don't have a name for it yet, but it's basically a farmhouse ale that's brewed with all American ingredients, American 6 row, some American unmalted wheat, and a little bit of flaked oats. And then it's all Cascade Centennial hops, including Cascade and the hopback. It's a more bitter beer at about 50 IBUs. I did add a little bit of mature sour beer to that beer at the onset of fermentation, again, just to suppress the funk a little bit on that one. And then it has a very small component of a 6-month-old wild Pilsner. So that was basically brewed like a Dortmunder Pilsner. I love Dortmunders. They're one of my favorite styles. I've actually brewed way more lagers commercially than I have wild ales. Maybe a little bit more on the opposite side of the spectrum from what I do now. But anyway, I really like what our mixed culture does after a lager primary fermentation. And so that beer has a little bit more hops, produces a really nice kind of a classic Brett funk. I like to describe it as kind of like Orval character. Where it's just that like kind of musty, horse stable, whatever you want to call it, horse blanket sort of flavor. Those really like spicy Brett Brooks phenols.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what that part of the blend brings to the table. And so, altogether, once it's conditioned and ready, it's my hope that it'll kind of end up tasting a little bit like a mixture between like a lambic and a very old, mature, 3+ year old lambic with some of those bright, like stone fruit tropical flavors from that farmhouse, that hoppy farmhouse ale. The wild lager I expect to kind of just get lost a little bit in the background, but to contribute hopefully some nice Brett character.
That's awesome. It's
I think it'll be a cool beer. I've definitely been looking.
I have a smile on my face just hearing the description of it. So that's and that's spring, summer ish.
I'm thinking probably maybe late spring. Okay. Yeah, we'll see. So there's certain beers that I make like that I don't plan to release for at least like 4 or 5 months. Okay. I think the first Oddities and Outliers blend, I think I conditioned that in the bottle for 9 months. The second one, I bottled that up in April, and we're releasing it at the end of this month.
Cool. I've been asking folks on the show occasionally over the last couple of weeks. It was the setup is my wife and I were rewatching The Good Place on Netflix just to sort of get away from the trauma of the world. And there's this whole concept of being able to walk through a green door and be any place at any time with anybody that you want. So if such wonderfulness existed on this plane of existence, and you could walk through a green door after this interview is over, where would it take you? What pub would it take you? And who would you be with to have a pint with?
Oh man. Put me on the spot here.
Thanks for listening to the show and knowing that this question was coming.
So I have heard the question a couple times on the show. And to be honest, I thought about it and I was like, man, I don't know how I would answer that question. And I still don't know how I would answer the question.
And you knew you were coming on. Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
This isn't gotcha journalism. Like, you knew this was coming.
I know. Yeah. So I'm kind of into beer history. And so, I've never met Ken from Sierra Nevada, but I imagine he would be a cool person to meet and to kind of talk to, especially when Sierra Nevada was just getting started. So I could see that as being something pretty cool. Yeah. I haven't been out to Chico. I've been to the North Carolina facility a couple times, which is really amazing. And I think a lot of beer drinkers that aren't in the industry can't appreciate how special that place is. I've been to a lot of breweries around the country, a lot in Germany, a lot in Belgium, and there are definitely some other really cool breweries that have way more history than that place does. But yeah, there's something magical about that place that I feel like just kind of captures the whole evolution of craft beer in the U.S.
Yeah.
And so I definitely like to pick Ken's brain, I guess, on a few things. I've had the chance to meet a lot of the lambic producers in Belgium, and this was all about 10, 12 years ago. Definitely had some cool conversations with them. The whole beer scene has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And in a lot of ways, I feel like not for the better. And I don't mean to sound like the old man yelling at clouds kind of thing.
No, you've come to the right show for that. Yeah.
But I have a strong distaste for a lot of the current styles. And we make a T-shirt. On the back of it, it says lactose intolerant since 2017. And that really upsets a lot of brewers nowadays. And, I wish that it didn't. I guess some of them can't take a joke too well, but yeah.
Again, they're making payroll. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And I don't hate them for what they're doing,
Yeah.
And the whole thing is, if they like making those styles and their customers like them and they're known within their niche for doing well at those styles, then great for them. I wish that those styles appealed to me so that I could go home and sleep well at night and feel like I made a great product, because I know that those things are easier to make. They're definitely more profitable. It's a better business decision to make those than to make the beers that I'm making.
Sure.
But I just, there's so much work involved in brewing. And I think a lot of people don't realize that I feel like if I'm going to work for low pay and lots of hours and, have all this stress and be exhausted going home from work, what's the payoff to me? To me, it's making a product that I'm proud of. And if you're able to do that, making some of the other styles that are popular today, then my hat's off to you. Good for you. I love making traditional German lagers. If I had more money in my bank account, maybe that's the brewery I should have opened. But I didn't have access to a lot of funds. I wanted to open a brewery that could focus on making the kind of beers that I wanted to make, where I didn't feel like I was beholden to a large, local demographic. Because of the type of beers that I make age so well, I don't have to be beholden to my local customers. I can ship stuff, around the country and around the world, and I'm able to pay the bills that way. But it's not the easiest way to operate a brewery. And so I guess maybe in some ways I wish I was lactose tolerant.
All right. So I'm mindful of time, but because you opened up this vein of, the old man and being angry at a lot of different things, if you in your position and from where you sit right now could offer up a resolution to the beer industry, we're coming up on the beginning of the year. People always try to, make empty, hollow promises, that kind of thing. But if you wanted to say, okay, everybody in beer, let's get together and make this one resolution together, do you know what it might be?
Stop putting bullshit in beer. Processed foods don't belong in beer.
Perfect. Done.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd wear that shirt too. Stop putting bullshit in beer. Yeah. Sold. Well,
yeah. I mean, there are some good beers that are made with plenty of adjuncts. I don't mean to make it sound like there aren't, but it's just, they're not my style of beer. And I long for the old days when you went into a brewery and the beers on the wall were to BJCP styles. I used to tell people when I first entered the industry, when people had asked, what kind of beers do you like? Or what kind of styles do you like? And I'd say, I like all styles except milk stouts. And it's just because I don't like the way lactose tastes in beer.
Yeah.
And I had somebody ask me like 6 months ago, what styles of beer I don't like. And I was like, well, how much time do you have? And,
oh man.
And So they said, I don't know, I got plenty of time. So I think I riddled off a list of maybe like 10 different things. And they were like, all right, well, what do you like?
Yeah. Yeah. It's just easier
And
at that point to actually answer the question. Yeah.
yeah. But I feel like we've gone so far away from what, good traditional beer used to be. And there are still some breweries that are doing an exceptional job, and my hat's off to them. But, when I lived in South Carolina a decade ago, I could go to a grocery store over there and find better, fresher beer for my palate than I can now living in a major metropolitan area in South Florida. And, it's just kind of depressing in that sense. If you told me that 10 years ago, I'd have better beer options in rural South Carolina than I would 10 years from now in South Florida, I wouldn't have believed you.
It's amazing.
Yep.
All right. Before we go too further down, I'm going to say thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate your time and your insight. And this went in a dozen different directions that I never could have anticipated. So, thanks for obviously walking us through oddities and outliers, but sort of sharing your brewing philosophy along the way. And hope we can actually do this in person soon, because this was a lot of fun. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you talking with me.
I do appreciate you listening to the show and sharing all of your beer thoughts and insight. You keep sharing, I'll keep responding. You can always reach me at John Hall. That's JOHNHOLL at beeredge.com if you like email, or I'm on Twitter at John_Hall. And a reminder that Beer Edge is on social media at The Beer Edge. And if you love smoked beers, and of course you do, a reminder to check out the This Week in Rauk Beer group on Facebook or on Twitter and Instagram by following us on at TW Rauk Beer. If you're interested in advertising, you can please reach out to Liz Melby. She's at liz@beeredge.com, and she'll let you know all of the information. And speaking of that, this episode was made possible by the support of NZ Hops, a cooperative of master growers, whose legend and cultivars have been crafted for over 150 years with creativity and passion to produce some of the world's finest hops. With a dedicated hop breeding program and farming knowledge handed down through the generations, the current day master growers proudly provide 18 unique New Zealand hop varieties to the world. Visit nzhops.co.nz or find them on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn at NZHops Ltd to learn more. We're also brought to you by Stomp Stickers. Stomp is a proud member of the Brewers Association that produces a wide variety of printed brewery products, such as beer labels, keg collars, coasters, beer boxes, and much more. Stomp's website features an easy-to-use design tool, low quantity orders, fast turnaround times, and free domestic shipping. Visit stompstickers.com and use code DRINKBEER15 for 15% off your first order. One last reminder to go to beeredge.com to see all that we have going on, including the merch page, and check out the Beer Edge podcast. Steal This Beer has new episodes every Monday, and the BYO Nano podcast drops on the 15th of every month. And as for this show, you know it. Nate Schweber, he does the music. Jeff Quinn designed our logo, and I'm John Hall. New episodes release every Wednesday, and that's when I'm going to be back again to drink beer and to think beer.